Good morning. It's Thursday, 9:30 in Berlin and Europe, and it's Space Café time, and our Space Café Law Breakfast with Steven Freeland will begin soon. Thanks for joining us for our breakfast roundtable today. You can see this wonderful cafe house environment we came together, and as always, we appreciate your participation and ongoing feedback. I'm Torsten Kriening, your co-host today and publisher of SpaceWatch.Global, and we are a Europe-based online platform for information in and about space and new space activities in a geopolitical context. I would like to thank all of our private and corporate supporters that showed their commitment to keep our independent journalism alive. We really appreciate that. And I know many of you are already familiar with our website, our bi-weekly and daily newsletters, and the Space Café podcast. The latest one features Daniel Leib from the Iceland Space Agency, and we also have new exciting episodes of the Space Café Radio, one with Kevin O'Connell in our mini-series from the PSSI conference. So don't miss them, they're worth your time. And our fan shop is open for you also. It's always open because it's on our website, so just a click away to become a real Space Watcher. And if you've missed any of our previous web talks, we have an archive available on our webpage in the event section and on YouTube. And we will host our Space Café Law Breakfast with Steven Freeland live on a bi-monthly basis, and we will continue next year. And with that, I'm handing over to your host today. I hope you made it back to Sydney, Steven. The floor is yours, and I'm being quiet until I'm asked to do the reality check.
Oh, hi everybody. Thank you so much, Torsten. It's lovely to see everybody. We've got a fantastic discussion coming up, I have no doubt, with just amazing people. And here we are in this great cafe. I'll ask Lucien to tell us where we are in a minute. But welcome. This is now, I think, our 11th. I got it wrong last time. I think it's our 11th Space Café Law Breakfast. So we are becoming a bit of an institution now, which is great. And I think the discussions have been far-reaching, they've been innovative, and I think hopefully interesting and generating more debate. And that's what it's all about. You know, it's about discussion, it's about demystifying law, it's about seeing what's relevant, how law fits into a broader picture. And I think that's part of what we're going to do today. But first, our main tradition is to work out where we are. We're in this amazing place, the Bibent Café in Toulouse, at the invitation of one of our guests, my dear friend Lucien. So Lucien, I'll introduce you formally in a minute, but welcome and tell us where we are and why are we here?
With pleasure. Welcome to the Bibent, which is one of the oldest café in Toulouse. I was saying by my colleagues of the TSE, the Toulouse School of Economics, that there, Adam Smith brought the first pages of the Wealth of Nations.
Oh.
Bibent is today one of the most interesting place in Toulouse. This is an excellent restaurant, which has been taken over by one of the French big chefs a few years ago. It serves very good meals, and on Sunday you can get interesting brunches. And to tell you the very true, Bibent means in local language drinking while drinking. Lastly, let me just tell you that the Bibent is located at the heart of Toulouse, which is otherwise called the Pink City, as you may know, La Ville Rose. And it is very close to the Place du Capitole, where you can find the City Hall and the Opera of Toulouse. And maybe you know that the Toulouse public is a public of bel canto lovers, and it has the reputation in the world of being one of the most severe, perhaps more than the Milanese public of the famous Scala. And all tenors, more particularly, and I just want to say hello to Olga, most tenors tremble at their premiere when they come to Toulouse and they do their play.
Wow. Okay. So firstly, we're sitting with where Adam Smith sat. What amazing. But fortunately, although we might ask Olga to do some singing later, fortunately, we don't have to do any singing, and therefore the Toulouse crowd won't boo us. I've been to
I just want to jump in here, Stephen,
Yeah.
for 1 second, and want to correct Lucien. Don't be that brave to say that Toulouse might be nicer than Milano, because our editor-in-chief is based in Milano, so that can get you in trouble for further publication on our magazine.
Oh dear. We haven't even started talking and we've already created a diplomatic incident. You know, can you believe?
But we are one Europe.
We are one Europe. Look, it's wonderful to be here. I've been to Toulouse as a guest with Lucien, and it is a wonderful city, and it's just lovely to be here. So thank you. All right, so we better move on to all things space. And today we're going to be focusing, because of the expertise of Olga and Lucien, we're going to be focusing on the private space sector and how that interacts with a whole range of things. You know, we'll look at the significance of the private space sector and how that increasing significance is, or perhaps is not, compatible with the international and national frameworks for space. We're going to see how law will cope with the technological development that the private sector in many countries, not all, is driving, you know, and what tools that regulators might use to overcome this. And Olga is going to tell us about this tool that she's come across in other things called a regulatory sandbox. Who knew there was such a thing? But, you know, can that be applied to space? And we'll look at ethical and conflict of interest and market forces issues and how they impact on private sector, and then how those impacts on the private sector might sit with the broader space sector and might sit with law. So fasten your seatbelts and let's have this discussion. We've got, as I said, two dear friends, but just amazing colleagues and experts. We've got Lucien, who you've just heard from, Lucien Rapp, professor of the Faculty of Law at the University of Toulouse Capitol, where he teaches international business law, market and international trade law, competition law, foreign investment law, international arbitration, advanced technology law, and of course, space law. And just listening to that, you hear about this multifaceted nature, how many elements are relevant to space. For 10 years, Lucien's been the scientific director of an academic chair known as SIDIUS, which was created 10 years ago by major space actors Kness, Airbus Defence Systems, and Thales Alenia. So welcome, Lucien. And then we have Olga. So nice to see you, Olga. Olga Volynskaya, such an old friend. It's just so lovely to see her. She's an international space law with 15 years of academic and practical experience in law policy and diplomacy. She was the chief international law advisor of the Russian space agency Roscosmos, practiced space diplomacy at the Russian Foreign Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and she's an assistant professor of space research department at the Lomonosov State University in Moscow, and she will tell you now where she is based. So welcome to both of you. Let's quickly move on to our next tradition, the one word. So we ask all of our guests, what is the one word that you might use to describe the wonders of space or space law? Torsten's put on the screen the words that some of our other guests have used. You can see Torsten's is ambiguous, which I think reflects his reality check persona, and mine is intergenerational, but you can see we've got great words there. So Olga, welcome to you. Tell us about your word. How would you describe space and space law, and why?
Thank you very much, Stephen. Well, first of all, many thanks to you for this invitation. It's so good to be with you today, to be with all our space people, the space watchers, and particular thanks to Lucien for choosing this wonderful place. It's a dream, honestly. And oh, by the way, a particular thanks also goes to Torsten for booking us the best table in this restaurant. So today I'm joining you with a cup of true Arabic coffee and a very special Arabic dessert, which is called baklava. So I'm joining you today from Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia, which is my home now. So Saudi Arabia, this kingdom is truly a bright star in the constellation of spacefaring nations. As Torsten knows very well, has heard it like a couple of weeks ago at the Connecting Skies conference here in Riyadh with the best people, best space people all over the world. This country is aspiring to become one of the top 5 spacefaring nations in the years to come. So with a huge ambition, but they do have something to show us that what they can do. Or for instance, we have all been very surprised at what they can do during the World Cup against Argentina, and I think they have a lot in store, you know, as regards to space activities. So my one word to describe space is young. It's about young nations, young space nations. It's about all of us, all the space people, regardless our age. We are young, we have this spark in our eyes, we have this energy to explore, to aspire for the unknown. And the various space activities are also very young. We have been exploring space for less than 65 years, less than a human life actually. And space law is also very young. There is so much more knowledge there waiting for us. And we're only, in my mind, at the beginning of our journey.
Well, young, I love that. That's so inspirational. And I'm so glad you said 65 is very young because, as you know, I'm a Sputnik baby and that is my age. So I'm glad that I'm fit into that. Thanks so much, Olga. That's great. Lucien,
Yes.
How would you describe space? What's your word for space?
I would say smart. Smart because intelligence in French. Smart because space is smart and requires the smartness. Let me just explain you. Smartness, being smart, is the main quality that we can expect from a man or a woman, and especially a young expert in space activities in today's world. Being smart means first being able to adapt, and space requires that we adapt. And in a world as tumultuous as the one that as we have entered, we must adapt, and we must not live in conservatism and in the religion of what has been done and is now over. We must, for example, accept that private companies can exploit space resources, even though the treaties of the last 60s might be opposed to this. And I personally agree with the American approach in the Artemis Agreement. Being smart also means showing 2 other important qualities in the today's world: being creative and anticipating. Without creativity, there will not be no space adventure. And the faculty of anticipation is necessary in a world in which we have the feeling of going from dead end to dead end.
So I feel honored that we're talking about something that is both young and smart. They're 2 excellent words to add to our list. Thank you both. So, as I said, we're going to talk about the private sector mainly and its impact on space more particularly. We're all aware that particularly in the last 20 or so years, the rapid development of space technology and the increased dependency that all countries have in space has also meant that we now have a global space economy, which has boomed. Already, as people would be aware, in the 1990s, if I may use the expression, the dollar value of space, of commercial space, overtook and began to exceed the value of traditional government space. And while both are growing, that private aspect of space economy is growing even faster. It's now a $400 billion industry, depending on which investment bank you believe. And, you know, as a former investment banker, I take what they say with a grain of salt sometimes, but depending on which one you believe, this is going to be a $1 to $3 trillion industry by 2040. So Lucien, perhaps to really set the scene for our discussion, could you describe to us how private sector, non-governmental entities contribute to space? What major changes, developments they've spurred? For example, I know in your work that you talk about the digitization of space being led by the private sector. Put it in context for us. You know, what does the private sector do for space?
Yes, with pleasure. This is a very large question, which I am going to try to answer. Yes, space activities have evolved profoundly since the very beginning of the century, with the emergence of an important private sector. This sector now makes a significant contribution to the space sector economy. This doesn't mean, of course, that it is called to replace the public sector of the space. We should even collectively wish that the two sectors coexist and collaborate in fruitful private-public partnership. As you noted, the world space industry welcomes young companies, most of which have emerged from the digital revolution. The digital revolution has produced three main consequences. The despecialization of infrastructure, which leads to the interoperability with other media, the dematerialization of contents, leading to the reign of data, and the multiplication of terminal equipments, which pave the way for the multiplication of commercial services. And with the development of a constellation of small, mass-produced satellites, space infrastructure have become commonplace. Data from space is now the main resource of the space business, while space technologies penetrate deeply into many traditional sectors of national economies. And the means to access space services are diversified. Space, to summarize the situation, space has become more accessible financially, technically. Technologies and services are developing. The number of operators is multiplying. New business models are emerging, and this is what we name the digitization of space.
Yeah, it's interesting that, you know, the trends are there. And of course, it's no coincidence at all that Amazon and Meta and, you know, all of the digital companies are now heavily invested in space. So, Olga, we just heard from Lucien about this seemingly irreversible growth of private sector, innovation, technology. As we mentioned right at the outset, we have an international legal framework about space. How does that contemplate the activities of non-governmental entities? That's pretty straightforward, but what problems can you see? What gaps are there in the framework, given how this technological digitization that has happened so quickly? What gaps are there in the framework that we need to address as this trend continues?
Well, I'll try to reply very briefly. Otherwise, we'll need a whole series of space lunches and gala dinners. So let's start with the basics. As you've already said, we do have international space law, and a regime regarding non-governmental entities is there. However, it is very limited. So the Outer Space Treaty does establish international responsibility of states for their national space activities, including those activities performed by non-governmental actors. Then the Outer Space Treaty requires every responsible state to establish mechanisms of authorization and continuous supervision with regard to such activities, that is, including private, including new space activities, which means in most cases licensing regimes, and in turn private sectors are obliged via national legislation to take in due regard this licensing regime, to respond to the state when it asks enforcement of this or that national rule, that is, of international space law rule via national regulation. But of course, it's not enough. Well, international space law was developed by states and for states, and there is not much about private activities there, especially when we talk about new space activities. So this is why we're facing serious challenges right now. Well, and as to the gaps, the most obvious ones, well, for instance, we do need special legal treatment, special legal international law approach to the most pertinent problems, mostly technical problems, I should say. Well, to name just a few: on-orbit servicing. Who will be liable if something goes wrong? Who is to register a whole bulk of space objects which take part in the on-orbit servicing operation? If an accident occurs, what can we do next? How can we approach this problem with the legal point of view? Then, of course, commercial space mining, a lot has already been said about that. Space debris. We need to see what's actually there, what's flying above our heads. We need to have the most updated information about that. We need to make correct decisions based on verified data. And the current international registration regime is not enough. It does not suffice, because it does not provide us this 24-hour information, which is verified and which is available to all, to space operators, etc., which can be used really live to take operational decisions. But then we have a whole lot of other issues. Well, as Lucien has already mentioned, the issue of mega constellations. How can we approach this problem of launching mega constellations? This problem has various sides. One side, a backdrop for the astronomers. Astronomers do not like many satellites in orbit because they interfere with their astronomical observations. They interfere with their job, actually. On the other hand, space operators who launch mega satellite constellations need more flexible regimes. First of all, registration regime, because the one existing now in space law and enforced by governments is not applicable anymore. It's not so good anymore. It is already an obstacle for developing such new technologies. It's just to name just a few. And well, the main problem to my mind is that national space laws indeed have to catch up with what is going on, with how the space technology develops. And I'm convinced that the time has come for private international space law. And UNIDROIT is already working hard in this direction. We do have to face and to deal with the ongoing challenges. The challenges like the global pandemic, the global geopolitical turmoil which we are facing now. We have to deal with that. Long-term sustainability is our ultimate goal. It's also a challenge for all of us in terms of space activities. I think I should stop here. And one more thing that I wanted to tell all our friends, all our space watchers, all these questions, all the various approaches to how law, space law, international law can be useful in terms of regulating the unknown, regulating the future space activities, new space, will be addressed in a wonderful book, which is expected to be published next year, the book called Routledge Handbook 2 on Commercial Space Law. It will be co-edited by Leslie Jane Smith, Susan Wintermuth, and Ingo Baumann. I strongly recommend everyone to get acquainted with this book, because it will address such wonderful issues, very interesting issues, like, for instance, agile contracting, waterfall management, we'll say blockchain, how these technologies coming from digital economy can help in practice, can help new space, can help governments to promote space activities. So this is a must read, I should say.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing that with us as well, because firstly, you've raised so many issues, but secondly, it's fantastic to see that we're getting, experts, practical experts, practitioners, as well as academics coming out and actually talking about these real problems that face us, as opposed to the traditional issues, which is still important, but there are many books already about that. So Lucien, if I can turn to you, Olga talked about national law, and so clearly with private actors in space, national law plays an increasingly important role. We've all talked in the past about more and more countries having national law. I know your Sirius Institute has an excellent database on national law, which I've used many times because I've advised many countries about national law. So thank you, and keep up the good work. So from your perspective, what do you think we need to emphasize in national law, in national space law, to help this development of technology? Remembering that it's always a balance, isn't it? Because a balance between the compliance with the regulations and of the international regulations and encouraging entrepreneurship. But even more fundamentally for me, and this is where your expertise is so important, should we be prescriptive to the private sector? Is this an issue for governments to be closely involved with in terms of the involvement of the private sector in space? Or should we be a bit more laissez-faire and leave that to market forces and technical issues to solve the problem and let the government stand away from that? What's your view on that?
Yes, let me start by a few words about our database of legal text applicable to space activity. This is indeed an innovation which we are very proud to have developed. Before 2017, there was no such database, and the compilation of the text was done by hand. I remember that when I was trying to raise some money to support our effort, I met somebody who told me, but you are going to destroy a job and make an unemployed person. Since then, we have enriched our database. This is not finished, not terminated, and we have to put some additional efforts on it, but we are trying to keep it up to date, which is not easy. And I'm glad to observe that today we are being copied, and this is a good indicator. This database is useful and daily used, as you mentioned, which we are happy about, especially by lawyers. But it is even more interesting because of the information it provides on the increasing number of national legislation, and especially on their proximity. This means that tomorrow, if we wanted to make the international rules relating to space activities evolve, it would be enough to let national laws converge, and rather than convening a large international conference, which in the current context would be doomed to failure, we could thus have a unified and harmonized corpus facialis. On this basis, we could perhaps imagine the implementation of an international civil space organization on the model of the ICAO, which is cruelly lacking today. Let me revert to your question. Your question refers both to the substance of the legal text and to the technique of the law. On the substance of the law applicable to space activities, I think that the most important effort is still to be made in the field of debris, both existing debris and future debris. Did you know that during the sole month of May 2021, as many satellites were launched into near space as during the world year 2019? And it is not surprising to note that along the past month, important modifications were made in this regard by several states to their national legislation. These modifications aim to limit the accumulation of debris by imposing on operators the obligation to organize the end of life of satellites and the progressive elimination of all harmful substance. We must be concerned about the fact that the large constellations that are being deployed are all American or Chinese, and for some of them entirely private. This may raise delicate questions of sovereignty for the state that will simply be their clients. To take only the case of European states, which do not have a constellation at the moment, we cannot exclude that they will be forced to apply to the regulation, to apply to the constellation, the two regulation that they have just adopted, the Digital Market Act and the Digital Services Act. Regarding the legal technique, here we find the classic dilemma you mentioned. Should we let the market impose its rule through prices and competition, or should we influence or try to influence the behavior of operators through legal obligation? In addition, we must get used to the fact that with the development of the private sector, part of the regulation of space activities comes from the contracts that operators sign each with the other. It will therefore be necessary to pay particular attention to ensure that these contracts respect the principles of space law and that the regulation of private origin is not in contradiction with the international regulation of space activities.
Oh, you've covered so much there. I agree completely that we just have to try to, but it is a balance though, isn't it? You know, and you talk about China and America. I was at gave a talk yesterday at a conference here in Australia, and I mentioned the recent filing at the ITU by Rwanda for 327,000 satellites. Now, you know, you can do your investigation as to who that represents, et cetera, but you know, 327,000, and that's by if you like, an emerging, developing spacefaring nation. So it's not just China and America anymore. It's, you know, this is a worldwide problem, but you're absolutely right, Lucien. You know, these are difficult issues, and it really is a balancing act. So we've got to regulate this. We've got to find some way of regulating it. Part of it is, and Olga, you already talked about it, regulating for the unknown. But you've told me, Olga, that some of your work is on various techniques for regulation. You looked at the finance sector, and you've talked about, as I mentioned, a regulatory sandbox. I'd never heard of it, didn't know about it, but you are a world expert on regulatory sandboxes as they've been applied to other sectors like the finance sector. So, and you suggested to me privately that maybe we should look at that sort of technique for space as this technology develops. So can you enlighten me and others perhaps, what is it that you're talking about and how might that help us to try to find this balance that Lucien's talking about?
Well, you're too kind to me as always, Steven. I'm just started getting acquainted with this tool, Regulator Sandbox. I also first found out about it only recently when I got the information, or got involved in finding the information about the booming high-tech sectors here in Saudi Arabia, and found that there is such a tool, and a very curious tool, like a Regulatory Sandbox, which to my mind could indeed be used for us space lawyers. Well, let's talk a bit about what it is, how it looks like in other sectors, in digital, in finance, banking, etc. So when we look at the traditional industry model and space industry in particular, in most cases, there was close and continuous cooperation between the governments, the regulators, more precisely, and the space industry itself, space companies. But now we can see that private space companies are unwilling to disclose what they are doing to their governments, which is why national regulators do not know what the new ideas, what the innovations are about. And of course, they have reasonable grounds to doubt whether these innovations might be okay or might not be okay to be launched in the market. Maybe they will be disruptive in a bad way, discriminative, so to say. Well, and the main challenge is that governmental agencies, regulators need to know what these innovations, including space innovations, are about. And to do that, a regulatory sandbox may well play a useful instrument. Well, what is it about? It's a controlled environment to live test new products, new ideas, technologies, or business models under the watchful eye of a national regulator. Well, to put it simply, let's say I'm a national regulator and you're an innovator, space innovator, say. You come to me and say, okay, I have this bright idea. I want to launch it into market. I have a first look at your idea, at your innovation, technology, etc. And I think, oh, I'm not so sure about that. It seems to me that this idea may be discriminative to this or that category of the population. Or this business model you propose may lead people to face fines, because your program, so to say, your software may work out not as well as you suggest. Okay, let's come together, let's play in regulatory sandbox. I, as a regulator, put a frame for you, a frame made of regulations that are already in place in my country. I invented them, I'm enforcing them. So here they are. Here is the frame, regulatory frame. I explain it to you how it works, the rules that are already in place, the rules that you are supposed to abide by. If you agree, you come and play in this inside, this frame, and you test your product. Well, say I can give you a target audience with which you can test your product, the market viability of your product, whether the audience likes it or not, whether they are inclined to buy it or not, on the one hand. On the other hand, you test your product whether it corresponds to the rules I have established. There's this regulatory framework that is already in place. And it is both beneficial for you as a space innovator and for me as a regulator, because you appear in a predictable regulatory environment. You already know the rules that I have established. And I, in my turn, thanks to you, thanks to your actions, can find out whether some of the rules that are already in place hinder the development of your innovation. That is why we are helping each other. And well, I think that this game, this regulatory sandbox, may find its place in the space sector. Well, at least I can see that there are very curious prospects for that here in this region, in the UAE, in Saudi Arabia. And by the way, this very instrument is already used in 60 plus jurisdictions all over the world, and was first invented in the United Kingdom and successfully applied there. So I think we can have a look at it. Due to the fact that the idea of this instrument seems beneficial for both the government and new space, and might help them both.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? And I'm amazed that you said it's used already in 60 jurisdictions. It makes perfect sense for this regulating for the unknown, but I suppose we require a sophistication and a pragmatism amongst regulators in this hazardous area of space where things go wrong, where we have failures. So it requires a bit of a change of mindset, but it's an interesting tool. So we've been optimistic. We're saying, this is an inevitable trend. I've quoted figures from investment banks. Everything looks rosy in terms of private sector involvement. But we know this is a terribly difficult time we're in. And I'm already noticing, for example, in some of the work I do, that the risk capital, the venture capitalists, are less now inclined to invest in these really horribly difficult geopolitical times we're in, with all sorts of uncertainties, with all sorts of consequences as a result of globalization. I'm finding that risk capital and capital investment for space is less available now to support private sector innovation than it was perhaps a year ago or whatever. So, Lucien, we've been rosy, we've been optimistic, but what could go wrong? And if things go wrong and this trend where we're relying increasingly on private sector innovation stops, or that tendency reverses, what effect would that have on the sector? What effect would that have on law? Where do we have to be cautious?
Yes, before being pessimistic, let me revert to the excellent comments from Olga a few minutes ago. Two short comments. First, the regulatory sandbox is a technique which is often used in the competition law field. When you are facing an innovation, it's very common to try to protect this innovation in putting out of the market and the rules of the market. And the sandbox is an excellent idea to try to develop innovation in the space sector. My second comment is about another technique which could be used in the space sector in order to improve the regulation. This is the technique of review. In order to adapt the regulation to the technology and to the innovation, what is often used in Europe is to stop after a period of time of, let's say, 5, 6, 7 years, try to see what happened, how much the regulation was efficient. And according to the conclusion of this review, we can either go forward or stop anything. And this is another way of trying to deal with the necessary adaptation of the regulation to the innovation, to the techniques. So going back to your question, which is a very interesting question, we do not need to be pessimistic. We are in a context which is made of 3 main trends, which are of concern, which could be threats, but which we have to deal with. The first element is in relation with the geopolitical context. We have presently 2 major friction points in Europe with the Ukraine and in Asia with Taiwan. And these geopolitical elements have various impacts on the world space industry. For example, it provokes a surge of certain sectors of the industry, in particular space imagery, Earth observation, telecommunication, but it also induces a militarization of space and triggers the emergence of new threats such as cybersecurity, and it obviously has consequences on the supply chains, on energy, and on international political cooperation. The second element is in relation with climatic events, with the accumulation of extreme climatic conditions such as drought, hurricanes, mega fires. And the space industry is called upon to play an important role, first by the data it produces on climate change, but also because it is questioning itself as a polluting industry. A few weeks ago, I was very interested in observing that during the last IAC in Paris, the pollution of atmosphere was raised as a concern for the space industry. I mean, the pollution which would come from small or micro satellites falling and burning into the atmosphere, and this is a new state on the way, according which space industry is trying to face its polluting image. And finally, we are facing presently an economic event of which we do not know the amplitude. This is the return of inflation, which could profoundly disrupt the world economy. This could affect strongly emerging spacefaring nations presently because of the present status of the US dollars on the monetary market. And the rising cost of electricity, of gas, is distorting European national economies presently, forcing companies to outsource or to look at any way of outsourcing part of their activities, again in countries in which the energy is cheaper than in Europe. And this happens at the moment where we are observing in Europe a movement of reindustrialization. This movement started again a few weeks ago, a few months ago, after the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this movement is likely to be stopped by this situation. And more recently, the crack in technology stocks on the financial markets should have an impact on financing young companies in the new space sector. That could be the three main events which we have to pay attention to.
Absolutely. You said you don't want to be pessimistic, but you've pointed to three, very serious issues. And one of the ones you pointed to is, of course, cataclysmic geopolitical events. And of course, we're all conscious of what's going on in the war in Ukraine. I see our dear friend Anna's comments in the chat. This discussion here is about peace. Promoting peace. It's not this is not a political forum, but we're all conscious. Everybody hopes for a resolution to the horrors of what's going on, that peace is restored, justice is brought to the fore, and that the suffering of many people in Ukraine ends. So thank you, Anna, for raising this. But I think this is not a forum where we're trying to discuss those sorts of issues, except to say that it's a disruption to space. But we are all here in the promotion of peace. So I hope you'll take those comments in line. Of course, we're always running out of time. So let me just look at you know, to Torsten, our reality check. You know, there's so much more we can hear from Olga and from Lucien, but we're in a bind, aren't we, Torsten? To a certain degree, don't you think? On the one hand, you know, the private sector, the innovation, all the things that Torsten's talked about, Lucien has talked about, we need it. Space needs it, so the argument goes, so that we can continually do things in space that promote peace, that promote benefits for all. So the private sector is crucial in many countries to that, and we've seen clear examples of that. On the other hand, the private sector motivations, we know, are not the same as the public sector motivations for space. And the frameworks that Olga's talked about are about the public sector frameworks of space, the peace, the cooperation, the benefits for all. So we're in a bind here, aren't we, Torsten? You're the reality check. Tell us, how do we balance that bind that we're in? You know, we need it, but on the other hand, doesn't sit well with with the fundamentals. Or am I wrong?
Oh, Steven, thank you very much. It's my 5 minutes of fame to save the world again. Yeah. So, and you challenge me every second month. So what I see is that we have these new actors, as Olga explained earlier, and we had the chance to be at the Connecting the World from the Skies event a few weeks back, and I had a great opportunity to talk to interview His Excellency Dr. Mohammed Al-Tamimi, the governor of the CST, and got a glimpse where they want to go. So, and they will announce their space strategy in a big event, and we really talk about a big event in spring next year. So I think the world will see something really breathtaking from that part of the world. And also in this event, there was Greg Weiler, and you didn't say it, but with eSpace, he is filing the 300-something thousand. And he talked also on stage together with OneWeb's Sunil Mittal and his vision, especially also in the Middle Eastern region. So these are private actors. And if we talk about the Übervater of the private in the private sector with Elon, I mean, he is dominating the market right now with a budget that is much bigger than many of the countries' budgets. I mean, an AWS space budget is much higher than most countries are put into space or into their space budget right now. And we are coming, and that's the reality we have here in Europe. We're coming from the ESA ministerial, which finalized yesterday with a breathtaking, never seen a volume of investment in space from the governments, from the member states in Europe to 16.9 billion for the next 3 years. But if you compare that with a budget of NASA, if you compare it with the prospected budget of Saudi Arabia to put in space, then Europe will find its place. So, but all the national programs are not falling into a framework which gives us a regulation, as you pointed out. I mean, even Europe is a patchwork of regulation. And yes, we love our diversity here, but I mean, we will see very, very soon the convenience of, or a flag of convenience, or situation in the space sector again. So where do I place my company? Of course, where I get the best deal, where I get the best regulation to fly from, and countries starting to compete. Is that a good thing, or in the situation where we are? And I'm not talking about the war only, I'm talking about the climate change, the overarching problems that we are facing, the losing of the biodiversity, things that are coming over us, which we greatly ignore because we are human. So we don't want to talk about it because it gives us a bad day. But that's a reality. And I mean, climate change is something we didn't spoke about 10 years ago. I mean, at least the majority, but it's there today. And when we heard the ministers are speaking in Paris the last days, Earth observation, monitoring to fight climate change. Yes, space has its stake in solving or being part of the solution, but it can't solve it at the end. So, but where the private sector comes in, I think, as a driver for innovation here. But we have to give it a fertile ground to grow from there. But I mean, maybe it's my German soul or my East Berlin soul, we need regulations for that. These unregulated turbo capitalism that we have seen over the last years in space, that can't go on. Otherwise, we have the next Elon very, very soon. And dominating not just the launch market, the satellite market, no, also our opinions and our voices very soon. I mean, I hope I have my Twitter account later on, or maybe it's closed, but I mean, everyone can get it these days. However, I know I didn't answer your question at all, but these were just my points. And I would say I can't see a solution right now on that, because the Outer Space Treaty and the drive from the private sector is not aligned with each other. So, and we will see in parallel universe, to stay in this metaphor, quite soon. And I'm concerned when we're going back to the moon now, not with the Artemis Accords. I mean, that's fine. I'm not a big fan of it, but I see the rationale for that. But we see it with the private sector. I mean, Japan gave the license to iSpace now. To do what? Is it correct? Is it not correct? I mean, of course, it's legally potentially correct, but is it good for humanity? I can't answer that. Sorry, I would say it's above my pay grade, but it's just above my limit. So I rely on the wonderful brains from you, from the law community.
Well, thank you, Torsten. You know, there are so many things that you've raised there. You know, I think you're right. You know, there are seemingly parallel universes, and the challenge, and this is the work that I try to do, is trying to bring those universes together. Not necessarily sitting completely, but the state sector can use the private sector. The private sector has opportunities, and their innovations can help with a whole range of activities. We just have to be perhaps selective in how we do it. But you're right, there's no simple solution. I know we've got questions. I know we're running out of time, but I want to give Olga and Lucien a crystal ball for a minute, and then we'll go to the questions if we can, Torsten.
Sure.
I know we always go over time, but you're so kind. Olga, crystal ball, what do you think the next big thing in space will be that's driven by private sector? And how, you know, will that play out in terms of benefiting us?
I personally vote for recycling of space debris, which is now in orbits, and this will help us build production right there in orbits to manufacture new space objects, their spare parts, on orbits themselves, on celestial bodies, to help us with our future space missions, and to generate energy. By the way, we really need energy right there in space, not to be launched from Earth, but we already have it there. We have the fuel there. We just need to use it. So I'm voting for recycling in outer space.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I've heard lots of recycling companies are acting, recycling companies in space. So thank you for that. Okay, crystal ball time, Lucien. What's the next big thing for space, do you think, that the private sector will generate?
I would vote for three innovation which would be the future of space activities. First, the development of assembly techniques in space. And I think that it could be something from which we could benefit very much in the next coming years. My second innovation is the link, which is the convergence, which is presently done between satellite networks and terrestrial networks. And I think that the hybridization of networks would be an interesting opportunity for all the telecommunications sector. And my third innovation would be the idea which is rising step by step of providing electricity from solar energy, solar energy station based in space. And that should be one of the solutions of the energy crisis which we are facing.
Okay. Torsten, your thoughts?
Yeah. Lucien, one question. I mean, I fully go with you for the reassembly, reuse of material in outer space and to do something out of that. But how do you manage that from the legal point of view? Who owns something? Because we have the discussion today with rendezvous and proximity operations already, or the active debris removal, then what can happen when I touch your satellite, all of that. And now you go one step further and say, okay, before we dumping it to the Earth's atmosphere, we recycle it. What is a wonderful idea, but how might that work from the legal framework?
I think that we have strong question in relation with the development of assembly technique. And one of the most important questions is how could we control these future station, private station, which would be will be totally autonomous? How we control this station from Earth? I mean, not only from a technical standpoint, but more importantly, from the legal point. How could we avoid that from this station we receive the services which would be a huge attempt to the sovereignty of the government and of the states? You know, these are very critical issues which are not solved. Our idea would be to modify, to change completely the approach which we have. Today, we consider that the applicable law is the law from the injection point. In the future, we should have a quite different approach based on the fact that the applicable law will be the law of the state in which the services are provided. But you're really right, there is a revolution to do in the legal field.
So Olga, as space lawyers, we've got jobs for life. I mean, how do you respond to that? Because you talk about recycling, and it's interesting, both you and Lucien both talked about recycling. You talked about creation of energy in space, you know, so it seems that's a common theme, but how are we going to deal with that from a legal perspective? You don't have the answer, I know, but where do we start?
Oh, you're right. It's a very tricky question for a lawyer in the first place. That's the question of the right of ownership and possible transfer of the rights, this right of ownership. We don't have any international law mechanisms for that, but we do have the grounds for this in the Outer Space Treaty, which preserves the right of ownership intact at every stage of space flight and operation of an object. Well, to my mind, what we might need to do, where to start with, the key is cooperation. The key is just approaching those that we know for sure who are owners of this or that object, which poses danger already, which is too big, which is not expected anytime soon to be burnt in the atmosphere or be moved to the graveyard orbit, whatever. We need to approach those owners like step by step. Of course, it takes time, it takes a lot of effort. But to my mind, it's our task with space lawyers to convince them that they have to transfer their ownership rights or give away their ownership rights, because we need to deal with this object. It's too dangerous for everybody, for space activities in general. And as to those objects which cannot be identified, which cannot be attributed to this or that owner, well, I think we also may find a solution at COPIOS, perhaps at the legal subcommittee. We might find a legal solution to convince the government, the delegates of member states of COPIOS, to convince to give this huge amount of non-attributable space debris out there, like plus than 10 metric tons, 10,000 metric tons of space debris, we might find a way to convince them to claim and to agree that this huge bulk of space debris is like wreckage. Or we have examples from the sea, shipwrecks, etc. A lot of interesting legal debate has been going on about that. I think that this might be a solution, because otherwise we will not find in any case this neither technical nor legal link to the owner of this tiny piece of debris. So we must find for legal solution how to qualify all that as wrecks, for instance.
And to do that, I mean, I'm finding this in the work I'm doing on space resources. We need to understand. We need to get so much information from a technical, environmental, cultural, there's so much information that we need to get together, which we don't understand, before we can even begin to think about trying to find regulation. I think you're both right. Torsten, questions. Where should we, we've got some great questions already in the
Absolutely. There's one question from Beck O'Brien, which really strikes me, and I think that's a great one for our two guests today. They go along with Mark's question. So Beck asks, do any of the presenters today have any examples of best or better practice of national regulation that balance the facilitation of private industry innovation in space activities with safety and sustainability? And Mark asks then, how can we come to more international cooperation and coordination to get better results? So, but I would like to focus on the best practice of regulation. Do you have a blueprint where you say, that's it?
Oh, great question. Lucien, do you want to start us off?
Yes. I mentioned the fact that a lot of regulation which have been adopted along the past years by governments are converging. And the main idea is to try to switch from a legislation which was based on the fact that the space activities were devoted to a sole operator, a public one, the state, and all the satellites of the states, to legislation which is much more attractive to private company. And I think that if you take our database, you could easily find a way of observing real point of convergence between legislation, which would be an interesting way to build an international legislation. Relating to best practices, I think that the approach of the American government is exemplary, and I think that if you take into consideration the way which is used by the US government, and which consists in screening all the new technologies, and based on this screening to launch tenders which will allow private company to benefit from public funding and develop innovation, that will be an interesting example to follow.
Yeah. Olga, do you want to add to that?
Well, as to my own experience, which was formerly with only one state jurisdiction, the Russian space industry, I can say that there is not much as an example in this regard when it comes to government supporting private space sector, and especially new sector, because in Russia, the space industry is monopolized 100% by the government, and there is almost no private space there, and the brightest examples that existed in the country, unfortunately, all of them failed. Well, that's just the thing. That's the traditional model of a space industry, which is hard to change. But here in this country, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, I'm seeing that this will be a really bright example. I'm only starting to get involved in it, to get acquainted with the approach, but already from the open sources, they are describing their strategy as both, well, two-dimensional. On the one hand, for the benefit of the government, of the people, the Saudis, and on the other hand, for the benefit of businessmen, the space sector. So these two will go in parallel, and as I can see already, the Saudi Space Commission is doing a lot to combine these two directions and to help each other and to develop the space sector with this strong foundation based on international cooperation and strong contact with the public sector. And well, this is my personal experience, not much for now, but I hope it will grow in the years to come. One more experience, which I strongly rely on, and I come back to the book I've already mentioned, the Routledge Handbook on Commercial Space Law. There is a very good and very informative chapter on the experience of regulation in the state of Delaware in the United States. And the co-authors, Catherine Daldirina and Susan Wintermuth, give in great detail an expert overview of how this regulation works, what opportunities it provides for new space companies, and why many businesses and startups, space startups all over the world try to get involved there, try to establish the businesses there, why it is so appealing to them. So I really strongly recommend addressing the experts in this book as regards to the practice of the state of Delaware.
Well, thank you, Olga. And if I can just add very briefly, I've had the honor of working with about 20 countries on their national policies, strategies, and law. Let me just point to one example, and that is New Zealand. So I was involved in the writing of the New Zealand law. And there, the government was very keen to be enabling, the points that Lucien made, enabling, promoting the industry, but at the same time, emphasizing important aspects about debris mitigation, about environmental, about, the peaceful uses, about best practice. And then they combine that in a in a framework of flexibility. So because they recognize that technology is changing all the time. Now, it's not perfect. Nothing is perfect. But I also, for the questioners, I direct you to the New Zealand law, which was very innovative, and I'm delighted to be associated with it, as trying to match all of these things together in the best way. Torsten, do we have time for another question?
Yeah, we have time for another one, but I'm really interested to see what Lucien just pointed to the Americas as one of the best example, and Olga to the blank sheet of Saudi Arabia, and the same with New Zealand. I mean, it's now I think 10 years ago that New Zealand established their space law under the pressure or under the push by Peter Beck to fly from there. And I mean, there's a history. So the question is, where are all the countries which are in between? Where are the best examples from them? And I don't want to go and force this question again. And we're moving to a very short one from Paramp, if I'm say his name correctly. What about the argument that some space debris has cultural value? There's space heritage that cannot just be removed. So what is it? And I think that's a fantastic one, and it's an easy one to fade out today.
Okay, Olga, space heritage. Our dear friend Alice Gorman has written a lot about it. You know that, and it's an interesting discussion, and I think a worthwhile discussion, part of the cultural aspects of space. So where does that fit into your recycling vision?
Well, I totally agree that space debris is very different, and we have to pay attention to this or that piece. And some pieces indeed can represent a cultural heritage, not only for one country, but for all the humanity. And when it comes to its legal protection, here the main question, the main problem lies how to protect it legally, how to find these tools, how to find these procedures, legal protection procedures, which would be enforceable. And to my mind, this the very tricky question, the most serious one. We cannot easily enforce some regulation developed here on Earth, there in space, especially with regard to an object which is space debris now, which is non-maneuverable, which we have no control of. Now he will have a conjunction of both technical and legal problems. So I'm afraid I cannot. I do not have a ready answer to that yet.
But we're working on it. Lucien, your last word here, the culture of space, the heritage of space, where does that fit in to this irreversible trend of private sector? And we heard from Torsten about some of the entrepreneurs. So how important is that? I'm assuming that you agree it's an important aspect to consider.
Yes, this is a tricky question, but basically I will share dear guests, comments on the vanity of debris. If we speak of a piece of paintings coming from a previous bracket, this doesn't mean anything, and I'm not sure that we have a cultural heritage. But if we speak of a satellite, of a military or civil satellite, of course, there is something which could be protected, and we need to pay attention to this kind of debris in order to protect them in view of giving them to our grandchildren and grandchildren. From a legal standpoint, the main idea which we need to keep in mind is the fact that these satellites, these out of services satellites are of course have been in the past registered, and they belong to government, and we cannot keep them even if we have very good idea in the mind. We cannot take them, keep them in museum and expose them without obtaining, without having the authorization of the governments of registration. And this is the main point we have to deal with. Could we consider that space debris are common good, something which anybody could get, or are we considering that every government has a word to take in the appropriation of these debris? And this is why, just to get back to the studies which we launched along the past years, this is why we are close to the idea of developing in the space sector what is existing in the maritime sector. It's called the salvage clause, which means that the insurance company has the right to get the property, the ownership of a debris which is got by a rescuer when we are speaking of a wreck, of course. And we have to think of trying to transpose this idea, this interesting idea of the maritime sector in the space sector. That could be an interesting way of trying to solve this great observation. For sure, of course, we have among the debris some cultural pieces which need to be protected.
Wow, I mean, fascinating. We really need to, we need 2 more hours, Torsten, for this, but it's time. We've come to that time.
You know, we can re-invite our guests. That's
yeah, we will.
Thing.
There'll be we will certainly invite them back. It's been a fantastic discussion. Olga, Lucien, thank you so much, for sharing with us your insight in this beautiful cafe, Lucien. And I know we didn't cover everything that we thought we could, but there's much more to discuss. But thank you. It's been a wonderful discussion. You've raised so many issues. You've got us all thinking. Torsten, likewise. So it's been fantastic. And of course, the show continues. The circus continues. And so let me just mention briefly our next Space Cafe breakfast, law breakfast, in the new year, Torsten. Golly, it'll be our 12th one on the 26th of January. We've got amazing people again. Deepika Jayakody, she's just a wonderful space lawyer. She'll be speaking she'll be in Chennai. So we'll be from a cafe in Chennai. And then my dear friend also, Skip Smith, American commercial lawyer who does incredible things, getting individuals on Axiom. That'll be a great discussion. We have to work out the time because we've got Chennai time, we've got Berlin time, we've got Sydney time, and we've got Mountain time in the US. So we will advise, but please come along and join.
I'm afraid that Berlin will lose this time, so we will do it on an absolute odd time for us.
I'm sorry, but again, thank you, Olga. Thank you, Lucien. You've just been fantastic, and thank you for sharing your time. And Torsten, thanks again for just being the best co-host. Back to you.
Oh, back to Elena. Elena,
sorry, my mic was muted. All right, before we say goodbye and pay our breakfast spiel, let me remind you of our upcoming events. So later today at 4 p.m. Central European time, we have our Space Café Scotland by Angela Matisse on the Sustainable Space Strategy for Scotland. On the 28th of November at 2 p.m., we're hosting the next Space Arbitration Association event on the question, can we arbitrate harmful interference disputes? And on the 29th of November at 4 p.m., join our Space Café 33 Minutes with Marco Ferrazzani on the outcomes of the ESA ministerial meeting. On the 30th of November at 4 p.m., tune in for our Space Café Israel by Meidat Pariente. And later that same day at 6 p.m., we're having our Space Café Italy by Dr. Emma Gatti in conversation with nobody else than the president of the Italian Space Agency, Giorgio Saccoccia. And on the 1st of December at 8 p.m., join us in the 59th Space Bar by Astor Agency. On the 6th December at 4 p.m., attend our Space Café 33 Minutes live from Scotland. And finally, on the 8th of December at 5 p.m., we're having our Space Café Brazil by Ian Grosner. Of course, as always, all events are going to be online on Eventbrite, and we would like to hear your feedback, so please check in with us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. Don't forget to sign up for our daily and bi-weekly newsletters, and if you'd like to treat yourselves with something special, become a Space Watcher today and support us. Take your credit card, visit our fan shop, and at shop.SpaceWatch.Global. And I know, but we need for you to support us to continue our work. So thank you all very much for your interest today. Thank you, Olga and Lucien, for the inspiring chat and for being our guests. Steven, thank you. Have you been happy with the program?
Oh, just wonderful. It's just been so good. It just gets better and better. And I'm already looking forward to our next breakfast in Chennai, of all places, which will be wonderful. But thanks, Olga. Thanks, Lucien. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Back to you.
Definitely looking forward to the next breakfast. And thanks again to the entire team behind the scenes for doing this great job week by week again. I hope you will all stay safe and healthy. And thank you for joining us. I hope to see you next week in upcoming events. In the meantime, visit our website, follow us on social media, support us, and don't forget, become a Space Watcher. Bye.